this edition of WION-VOA Co-Production. My name is Molly Kampir, and we are starting off with the latest on the tensions between the US and China over Taiwan and the key takeaways from that phone conversation that took place between the leaders of the two sides. The American President Joe Biden and the Chinese leader Xi Jinping spoke at length on Thursday morning amid a potential visit by the US House Speaker Nancy Pelosi to Taiwan, which Beijing has warned would be met with forceful responses. White House Bureau Chief Patsy Widakuswara getting us this report.
As Taiwan held its annual military exercises simulating action should Beijing invade, President Joe Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping held a call, their fifth since Biden took office last year.
They exchanged views on Russia's war in Ukraine and the global impacts it is having. And then on Taiwan, President Biden underscored that the United States policy has not changed and that the United States strongly opposes unilateral efforts to change the status quo or undermine peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait.
Officials would not say whether the call lowered bilateral tensions, and both sides provided limited information.
Both Washington and Beijing, in their public presentations at these meetings, always describe what they said. Neither side ever describes what it heard, which is arguably more important. It appears that they're hearing very little.
But Taiwan is a major focus. Taipei has staged air raid drills as concerns mount over tensions triggered by U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's unconfirmed plans to visit the island that Beijing considers its breakaway province.
I think that it's important for us to show support for Taiwan. I also think that none of us has ever said we're for independence when it comes to Taiwan. That's up to Taiwan to decide.
Beijing has repeatedly warned it will respond forcefully.
If the U.S. pushes ahead and challenges Chinese bottom line, it will inevitably face firm countermeasures. The U.S. side will bear all the consequences arising therefrom.
Biden and Xi are expected to continue their regular engagement, managing the strategic competitions between two rivals, where it's often fraught with tension but also has opportunities for cooperation. The two leaders could potentially meet in person next in Bali in November at the G20 summit. I'm Patsy Widakuswara at the White House.
And Jessica Stone with me on the broadcast for further inputs on this. Jessica, we've seen a lot of reaction there in Washington to the possibility that a senior American lawmaker, Nancy Pelosi, will be visiting Taiwan next month. What are the implications of such a visit if that happens?
Well, I want to be clear that Pelosi has yet to confirm that she's going to Taiwan. But if she does, she would be the highest ranking U.S. lawmaker to go to Taipei in 25 years. The last person who went was Newt Gingrich, and that was under the Clinton administration. And there is a lot of reaction. There's a lot of support, bipartisan support from members of Congress, both on the right and on the left, for her going, especially because lawmakers regularly make decisions with respect to spending that affects Taiwan. But the U.S. military has really made it clear through President Joe Biden that they have concerns about her going. The Associated Press reports that if she does go, she would likely go in a military plane, and that could be viewed as a provocation by Beijing. But earlier this week, Defense Secretary, or I should say former Defense Secretary Mark Esper, told the Atlantic Council that he does not believe that Beijing should dictate the moves of U.S. lawmakers, and in fact that they should not kowtow, and in fact that lawmakers need to make these trips in order to make better decisions in the U.S. Congress.
Jessica, Mark Milley, the most senior U.S. general, was in Australia this week, meeting with other Indo-Pacific military leaders. It's coming just ahead of more U.S. diplomatic engagement in the region. What do you make of this?
Well, there is clearly a lot more U.S. engagement from Southeast Asia to the South Pacific, especially since we saw that Solomon Islands agreement with China to provide security. We have just seen Mark Milley there, and that trip, he said, was very much focused on the China threat. He met with other Indo-Pacific military leaders. On August 1st, we're going to see Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman going to the Solomon Islands, with the new Australian ambassador, Caroline Kennedy, the daughter of the former slain JFK, the 35th president of the United States. And so there really is underway a tug of war in the South Pacific. All of those little islands, kingdoms that had been very important to the U.S. military strategy during World War II. We are seeing Washington reinvigorate its relationships with those islands, talking about putting embassies in Tonga and Fiji and Kiribati. And so I do think you are seeing definitely a ramping up of diplomatic and military engagement there.
Stay with me, Jessica. Just a quick update also on how the U.S. Senate has passed a $280 billion initiative that would boost domestic production of microchips and provide support for a key industry that competes with overseas countries, including China. As VOA's congressional correspondent Catherine Gibson reports, the bill is expected to clear the House in the coming days before President Joe Biden signs it into law.
After a year and a half of work, the U.S. Senate passed legislation on Wednesday promoting the nation's microchip industry by a vote of 64 to 33.
Today is a very good day for the American people and for the future of our country. I believe firmly that when signed into law, this bill will reawaken the spirit of discovery, innovation, and optimism that made America the envy of the world.
During a trip last week to a major U.S. manufacturing region in the Midwest, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi said the legislation would lessen America's reliance on China.
No longer will America always ever be dependent on something offshore that was created here, made in America, invented here, and we will, again, have the jobs here.
The bill will provide $52 billion in incentives for the U.S. semiconductor industry. But the measure is a downgrade of much more ambitious legislation addressing U.S. competition with China. But the bill's co-sponsor said this vote was a good start.
This funding sends a message that the United States is putting a strong down payment on maintaining our edge in the global technology race and preventing global supply chains from being weaponized against the United States, or for that matter, against our allies. Over the past few years, China has continued to increase investments in its domestic industries, and particularly in areas that confer long-term strategic influence.
With many Americans concerned about a weak economy and rising inflation, some conservatives criticize the cost of the bill, which is expected to create a $79 billion deficit over the next decade. Senator Bernie Sanders, who usually votes with Democrats, said this funding benefits wealthy corporations.
The crisis is caused by the industry shutting down in America and moving abroad. And today what we are doing is saying we are going to give you a blank check to undo the damage.
But ultimately, 17 Republicans voted for the funding, citing concerns about U.S. strategic competition with China.
I think this is about national security and about making sure we have adequate supply here at home of things that are absolutely indispensable. I wish that were inexpensive, but in this particular situation, it's not.
President Biden is expected to sign it into law. Catherine Gibson, VOA News, Washington.
And going back across to Jessica Stone. Jessica, this so-called CHIPS bill is a much narrower effort than U.S. lawmakers had initially hoped to pass, but it looks as if it makes some progress on strengthening the American research and development pipeline. Tell us more about that.
Well, listen, most of this bill does fund extra science, technology, engineering, and math research throughout the country. There's about $81 billion of that, $200 billion that's going to go right to the National Science Foundation to fund more elementary education in the STEM fields, also to get to rural states and universities, really change the way they distribute that kind of funding. And this bill is focused on the main areas of competition between the U.S. and China, and really the main areas of focus for many countries that are trying to dominate technology. That's quantum computing, that's artificial intelligence. Research money will also be restricted from universities that have relationships with Confucius Institutes, which of course have been controversial inside the United States because they are funded by the Chinese government, and there's been suspicions that there is too much control by the Chinese government of that money and of those fundings. There's also going to be, as there often is with a big bill that's passed by Congress, some extra funding for different things they needed to pay for, like space, the space program, money to protect the Supreme Court justices and their families. And importantly, you heard from Mitch McConnell there on the fact that he views this as a lot of money to spend. Well, they're not offsetting this from the deficit. This is going to add to the deficit. They have not paid for this $280 billion. What's the rationale? Well, they say it's national security.
Also, Jessica, the U.S. Federal Reserve Bank raised interest rates by 75 basis points again this week. This is the second time it's done so. What are the key implications for the American economy?
Well, there's really a tacit admission here by the Federal Reserve and by the Washington economic establishment that they need to rein in inflation. And we did get major economic news yesterday that indicates we are now officially in a recession. The White House says we're not, but we meet the technical definition of a recession in the U.S. economy now because we've had a downgrade, a shrinking of the economy for 2 quarters in a row. And this is impacting housing sales. These interest rates are already truncating and shrinking the housing market. We're seeing mortgage rates go up. And this is really the U.S. Federal Reserve, the central bank's effort to rein in inflation, which is at the highest rate it's been in 40 years, Molly.
All right, we're leaving it there for the moment. Jessica Stone, thanks very much for getting us all of those inputs.